Over the last year, I have personally talked one-on-one with more than 500 podcasters. Over the last 2 years and a half, I have personally analyzed 1,319 podcasts. And today, my podcast agency manages, grows, and monetizes at least 40 podcasts at any point in time. And in this video, I'm going to tell you 24 brutally yet honest truths about podcast. Truth number 1, your content isn't as great as you think it is. The number one frustration I hear from podcasters is, I know I have a great podcast, I know I have amazing content, but I'm not getting lots of downloads. I just need to get my podcast more out there. Well, one thing for certain is that if your content is that great, actually people come back once they start listening to your episodes because they just can't get enough. For every 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 new listeners that you have, they bring an additional 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 because the content is so good that they are talking about it to their friend. If this is not happening in the first place, then your podcast isn't that great. Your content isn't that good. The point being, if your podcast isn't growing on itself without any marketing at all, your content isn't as good as you think it is. If you really want to make your podcast compound on itself, you actually need to publish content that people really want to listen to. And to be able to do that, you need to define a clear target audience. You need to be saying, okay, I'm speaking to that typical person in particular. And then research what this specific audience is looking for, wants to consume of. So the way we typically do this with our clients is we're going to look at tools like Google Trends, Google Keywords Planner, social media trends, the 6 social media platforms, by the way, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter /X, TikTok, and YouTube Shorts. We are also going to look at Reddit communities and typical questions asked or Quora questions as well. Now, you might be thinking, oh, wait, but that is a lot of work. Well, welcome to the world of successful podcasting. Truth number 2, doing clips on social media from your podcast content isn't actually going to help you grow downloads, at least not materially. People want more of what they are already consuming, meaning if somebody finds your podcast via a TikTok video and find it interesting, guess what they are going to want more of? That's right, TikTok videos of your podcast. They aren't going to go from TikTok to a podcast platform to listen to you on a long form content. Now, there is some positive aspects in that, which is you are actually growing an audience outside of the podcast platforms on other channels, and we can expect a very small portion of that to actually go and try to find out more on the long form content. So, should you do short form media clips? Absolutely. Should you rely on this to grow the podcast downloads? Certainly not. What you want is to create an ecosystem, a brand around your podcast. Truth number 3, nobody cares about your newsletter. Now, this is better than nothing when it comes to capturing your audience emails addresses, because this is something you definitely want to do. Not only an email list allows you to inform your engaged listeners when the new episode goes live by landing directly into their mailbox, but that's also something you can use for offers from sponsors at some point or just to engage with your audience. Now, a newsletter typically converts a very, very small portion of your audience into email list. What you want to be doing instead is to have something of value that you can exchange against an email address. Understand an ebook, an exclusive video series, an exclusive podcast series, a quiz with a results at the end. The whole idea is to say, how can you give even more value to your audience in exchange of an email address rather than just saying, hey, join my newsletter to be informed when new episodes are live. This is how you actually get a high conversion rate from your audience. Truth number 4, you don't need a better, more expensive microphone. You need better content. Now, this is heavily linked to truth number 1, so I'm not going to repeat myself. But I see so many podcasters just investing so much money into podcast gear, into podcast background, whilst they are not getting more than 10 downloads per episode still. Now, nowadays, you can literally record with Apple earphones with the microphone on the earphone itself and run it through an audio enhancer software that is totally for free. The earphones cost literally $20. You can record with that and then run it through Adobe Audio Enhancer. I'm putting the link in the description. And that's something that will make your audio sound like you recorded in a real professional podcast studio. Focus on your content, less on your gear. And once you start having success with your podcast and it actually starts bringing money, then of course you should invest in your gear. Truth number 5, podcasts without video are meant to fail. Now, already in January 2023, and I'm going to read my notes for this one because there are some very interesting stats that came from this. Already in January 2023, a survey's results came out where they asked US listeners which platform they preferred for listening to podcasts. YouTube came out on top with 33%, in front of Spotify, which represented 24% of the US listeners, and in front of Apple Podcasts, which represented 12% of the US listeners. Here again, I'm putting the link towards this article in the description. Then again, in Q3 of 2023, YouTube became even more dominant in the podcast world. I'm putting the article in the description as well. But YouTube represents, depending on what source we are looking at, more audience than Apple Podcasts and Spotify combined. And this was back in 2023. The trend hasn't reversed since, and it's actually going more and more in favor of YouTube. You wonder why Spotify is pushing for more and more videos. I don't know if you noticed, but you can actually upload the video on your Spotify platform so people can consume your podcast in a video format. Video is the future of podcasts. Are people going to completely stop listening to audio only? Certainly not, but there is an increasingly bigger and bigger audience that consumes a video podcast. Also, if you're recording with video, here goes the social media clips, the snippets, the content repurposing that you can do on all of the short form platforms. So definitely video, you cannot overlook it in 2025 and moving forward. Truth number 6, if you aren't getting enough views on YouTube, it's probably because your thumbnails and your titles aren't good enough. Thumbnails and titles are paramount in YouTube. As Mr. B said, you can have the best video and the best content in the world. If nobody clicks on it, nobody will watch it. In order to have people clicking on your videos, you need to have great thumbnails and great titles. Also, the first 10 seconds of a YouTube video are critical. You need to deliver on the expectations set by the thumbnail and the title of the video so people actually understand that they are getting what they clicked on the video for. And then you can have a cliffhanger to make sure that people stick till the end of the video. This in order to maximize retention and therefore views. Truth number 7, there are more people consuming podcasts on Spotify than on Apple Podcasts. And I'm highlighting this one because I still see so many people focusing their efforts on Apple Podcasts for good reasons, right? If you rank in Apple Podcast charts, you can then advertise these podcasts as a top ranking one so that you can get bigger guests and you get recognitions around the world. But when we look at audience size and audience potential, Spotify is actually bigger than Apple Podcasts. And this is not even new. Here again, reading a quick piece of article right now. So Buzzsprout, which is the second most used podcast hosting platforms, reports each and every month on the stats that podcasts hosted on Buzzsprout are getting, and it's of course anonymized. I'm putting the link towards Buzzsprout statistic in the description. But according to them, for the last 11 months in a row, and I'm recording this end of December 2024, Spotify is getting more downloads than Apple Podcasts. And some months it's not even close. In October of 2023, Spotify got about 42% of the total downloads, and Apple Podcasts got less than 32%. So there is much more audience available on Spotify than on Apple Podcasts. Yet, a lot of podcasters still focus on Apple Podcasts and are not seeing the potential of Spotify. Truth number 8. If you are not looking at your statistics at least monthly, then you are not serious about podcasting. I talked to high hundreds of podcasters, and the sheer amount of them who do not even know how many downloads they are getting in the first 7 days of an episode release, in the first 30 days of an episode release, the retention rate they are getting, the lifetime downloads of a podcast, the number of recurring listeners each and every month is frightening. If you're not actively looking at what episode and so what topic or what guest is performing better than the others, where people stop listening to your episodes, and how many people actually come back after having listened to an episode, you're not serious about podcasting. You say you are, but you're not acting like it. You can improve your show exponentially if you properly track analyze, interpret, and make decisions based on the statistics of your podcast. Because this literally shows you what your audience, so your target audience, your ideal listener, wants to listen to from your podcast. There is no better source than your podcast statistics to understand what people want more of, what people want less of, and where and how you should structure your episode to make sure that you optimize retention rate and so that people stick till the end of the episode each and every time. Which leads me to truth number 9. If you're losing somewhere between 20 and 50% or even more of your audience within the first 2 minutes of your episodes, your introduction sucks. Like for YouTube videos, the introduction of an episode sets the tone and expectations of what listeners can expect from the episode. Get this wrong and you will lose retention and therefore listeners for your podcast. So yes, you might have a fancy music and a pre-recorded introduction that you paid a lot of money for, but if this actually makes people skip or even worse, drop from your podcast, this is not helping you grow your show. So here is what we've seen working very well when it comes to increasing retention rate, especially in the first few minutes of your episode. Number 1 is extract snippets from your episode that are relevant to the title that you've set for the podcast episode and put it at the beginning. Here again, what you want to do is to set the tone and expectations and show that people will actually get from this episode what they were expecting to get by clicking the title. And then what you want to do is, again, have a cliffhanger, have something that is not completely said to make people stay throughout the whole episode so that they can get the whole thing. You need to deliver on expectations from the get-go and to give a good reason for people to stick till the end of the episode. Truth number 10. Your titles are costing you listeners, especially if you're using ChatGPT for your titles. So, except for your hardcore fans, which are not as many as you might think there are, people base themselves on a podcast episode title to decide whether they are going to listen or not. So if you're not hooking attention, triggering curiosity, or even better, triggering emotions with your titles, you are not getting as many downloads as you could. Yes, I am telling you to be clickbaity in the title, but I'm most importantly saying that you should deliver on that clickbait in the episode. For instance, if you have an episode that you want to call 7 Ways to Beat Anxiety into Oblivion, then your episode should be giving 7 ways to beat anxiety into oblivion. And in the first 10 seconds of your episode, you should already give a hint of what those ways of beating anxiety into oblivion are, if not breaking down one of them right from the get-go. So people see and hear that they are going to get what they were expecting to get from that episode. Be clickbaity, and then deliver on that clickbait. Truth number 11, and this is something that a lot of people are going to have a hard time with. If you do not start with a niche podcast, you will never grow. Now, this might sound a bit dramatic, and of course, there might be some very small exceptions to this. But starting a podcast now, which is not very specific, will hardly grow. The Joe Rogans, the Alex Cooper, the Andrew Huberman, the Stephen Bartlett, all those people, the John Lee Dumas, which we have interviewed on the show, by the way, are already well established for years, if not decades, in the podcast world and are already attracting this mass audience. You want to start very, very narrow, or else you will be competing with much bigger and, quite frankly, much better podcasters than you, just because of the accumulated experience and the compounding effect of podcasts. Start small, think big, own your niche, and then expand bit by bit. Truth number 12, consistency matters more than you think. You cannot skip an episode, period. It is all about creating a habit for your audience so that they listen to you on a regular basis. This is how you get a compounding audience. It is much easier for me to remember that John releases a new episode every Tuesday at 8 a.m. rather than if it's sometimes on Tuesdays, sometimes on Thursdays, sometimes on Fridays, sometimes we have 2 episodes within 2 days, sometimes we skip an episode for a whole week. It makes it much harder to follow, whereas if you do have a weekly rendezvous, same time of the day, same day of the week, this will get people to get back and make it easy for them to get back to you. Truth number 13. Podcast takes time, not weeks, not months, years, and sometimes decades. Now, don't get me wrong. You can actually accelerate that, increase growth, and have success quite rapidly, depending on what the success criteria is. But podcast is indeed a long-term game, especially when it comes to having a big audience. Barriers to entry have never been lower. You can literally start a podcast within minutes and record with your phone. But keeping it up, publishing at least 52 episodes per year, improving the quality of guests, doing better content, learning, improving, this is actually very hard. Let alone attracting an audience, keeping that audience, and growing that audience. This has never been harder. Truth number 14, 95% of podcasts get less than 1,100 downloads per episode in the first 7 days. So back to our Buzzsprout statistic, this is something that you can consult at any time. A very small percentage of podcasters are actually getting the biggest piece of the pie. Making it at the top requires skills, patience, time, talent, and sometimes a little bit of luck. Chances are that you are never going to get more than a few hundred downloads per episode. And that would already mean that you are somewhere between the top 10 and the top 20% of active podcasts. Truth number 15, which is a bit linked to everything we've talked so far. Competition is fierce. Podcast is becoming mainstream. I had a guest on my show called Bill Caskey, by the way. If Bill, you're watching this, shout out to you, man, who said me something very interesting in our interview, and I'm going to quote him here. So Bill has started podcasting in the 2000s, so he's a veteran of podcasting. And he told me the following thing. Back in the days, you would ask a room full of people who here listens to podcasts, and you would have a few hands rise. Nowadays, you ask a room full of people, hey, who here has a podcast? And you will see most of the hands rise. Not only that, but depending on your niche, you might actually be competing not only with podcasts, but also Netflix if you're in the entertainment space, or YouTube or different blogs if you're in the education space. Now, of course, podcast is a very specific format, quite unique, which allows for a connection with the host, and this is why a lot of people would rather listen to podcasts. But eventually, there are other ways to get that outcome that you propose with your show. So you need to differentiate and you need to be very specific. Truth number 16. If you are not spending at least as much time prepping for an episode than you are spending recording that episode, you're doing it wrong. No matter the format, no matter the topic, you cannot wing it anymore. People's attention has reduced dramatically over the years, and now it's a matter of a few seconds. If you do not make your episode punchy, reactive, interesting, entertaining, if you do not research your guests, research your topic, have a clear idea of the structure of the episode, and think about how to make it simpler, better, more straightforward, if you are not learning from your past episodes, you won't become a better podcaster. Let me give you a practical example of this. Think about a guest that you are going to interview who has already been on other podcasts. Why should people actually listen to this new interview that you have conducted with that guest? What is unique about it? In order to prepare for this, of course, you need to research the guest, but you should also spend a bit of time listening to previous interviews, to previous podcast episodes where this guest has been guesting, because this will allow you to have a bit more depth, a bit more of a 360 degrees overview of what that guest has already talked about, and you can drill down on certain topics that have never been talked by this guest before in his specific niche. And here goes the very unique selling point that you have for your podcast. And this is the same for any topic that you tackle and any format of the episode that you want to put out. An ounce of pre is worth a pound of post. Prepare for your episodes. It is worthwhile. Truth number 17. Most podcasters don't monetize. And for those who do, most are not making more than a few $100s per month. Now, there are 4 main ways to monetize a podcast. Number 1, you do insert dynamic or static ads into your episodes. From this, you can expect somewhere between $10 and $20 per 1,000 downloads, 10 to 20 CPM, cost per mil, which is the word in French for 1,000. So you do the math. If you're getting a few hundred downloads per month, you're not close to making any money with dynamic or static ads. Second way to monetize a podcast is to have a subscription-based model. So here you say, hey, if you want to support the show, you can subscribe to my Patreon, Buzzsprout subscription, buy me a coffee, whatever it is, right? And you basically rely on the audience to engage with you and give you $5 to $10 each and every month in order to monetize your show. So here again, you need a pretty large audience to actually make a good money out of this. Plus, it usually requires more work because you want to incentivize people to give you money. So you probably need to release an additional episode each and every month for this specific community or do something on top of everything. Number 3, you can have specific sponsors targeted to your market. So this is where you start talking one-on-one with potential sponsors in the hope that you can monetize more than $20 per 1,000 downloads in order to have more than the $20 CPM. So we have clients ranging from $300 per 1,000 downloads, so a 300 CPM, which is not too bad, up to $1, $2, and sometimes even $3 per download. So $3,000 for 1,000 downloads. So this is where it starts getting very, very interesting. But this only happens as a consequence of a very narrow niche and a high purchasing power audience. And number 4, you can sell your own product, and this is where you make the most margin, and this is where we've positioned ourselves as a podcast agency as well, because we know that this is where the money is for podcasters who have an offer behind it. But the whole point is, if your audience is not narrow, you won't make a lot of money with your podcast. So back to the importance of niching down and choosing the right topic. Truth number 18, editing a podcast correctly takes time, despite all the amazing AI tools that we have today. So we recently onboarded a podcast that won multiple awards without having a professional team helping them out. And they were already doing quite well for themselves with around 60,000 downloads per month. Now, this team of podcasters, because there were 4, were spending on average 10 to 20 hours to edit one single episode, and they are releasing weekly episodes. They wanted to make sure that every details, every second of the show were perfect. They were looking at the whole thing and adding some sound effects, some music, looking at it from second by second to make sure that everything was crisp, everything was on point, and that the quality of the show was as high as possible. And they would go over the recording again and again until the episode sounded perfect. And this really reset our brain in terms of what it actually takes and the sheer amount of work that actually needs to be put in the editing of an award-winning podcast. Now, don't get me wrong. I would much rather have a podcaster that publishes consistently and that focuses on great content. But my point is, great editing takes time and skills. And this actually plays an important role into the growth of the show and of the audience. Truth number 19. Not every listener will engage, especially if you don't ask. So that is probably the most recurring quick wins that I get my clients to implement, and quite frankly, my prospect, because I'm giving this away for free. It is to actually ask the audience to leave a 5-star review and to follow the show. So many people are focusing on having call to actions for their sponsors, for ads, for their websites, for their newsletters, but they are not actually getting the help of the audience to grow the show. And a lot of people won't even have a call to action. Now, a podcast audience is usually very passive. If you don't ask, you don't get. And even if you ask, you're not sure to get. So you need to have a call to action at the beginning and the end of your episode that asks the audience to help you grow the show. Now, it needs not to be too pushy or too salesy. Here is the copy that we typically recommend our clients to implement. Hey, if you enjoyed this episode, if you learned something today, please consider following us on your favorite podcast app and leaving us a 5-star review. This takes literally 5 seconds. This helps the show more than I could say. This allows us to put this show in front of more people, so help more people like you, and that will mean the world to us. And 20 seconds, asking for help, people typically feel very much obliged, and this helps you get in front of more people. Truth number 20. It is easy to find guests. It is hard to find great guests. Let's face it. Nowadays, it's pretty easy to get somebody on the show. Everybody wants to be on podcasts, and it's actually quite a nice ego stroke to appear on a podcast and to be invited to guest on a show. But the guests that will actually bring value to your audience, the guests that you actually want to engage with if you're using this as a networking tool or as a way to generate leads, are hard to come by because, well, great people are busy and their time is valuable. And this is where having great content, having a growing podcast, having assets that are looking good and that are easy to share will play a significant role in getting those great guests in. Because if they're not getting something away from appearing on your podcast, why should they come? It's super important to see this as a value equation where the guests benefit from your audience and you benefit from the appearance of the guest on your show. It is a virtuous circle, but it is hard to create and hard to create momentum. Truth number 21, your guests might not reshare your podcast. Bringing guests on doesn't automatically mean that you will tap into their audience. For that, they need to actually communicate around the episode. And the only way you can ensure that they actually do that is by having a great podcast and by having great pieces of content that are easy to reshare and that are putting the guest under a good day, such as a good trailer, a good snippet, a good LinkedIn post, a good article even. You need to make the guest want to reshare because that makes them look good and or that brings value to their audience. If they don't see how the interview is actually going to benefit their audience or themselves because of an ego stroke or of authority building, why should they reshare? Truth number 22. SEO can make or break your podcast discovery. If you are ignoring SEO, such as an optimization for your podcast, you're leaving views and downloads on the table. Keywords matter. Optimize your titles, optimize your description, optimize your show title in order to improve visibility. Think about your podcast as a searchable resource, not just an audio file. Truth number 23. There won't be an overnight success, but not for the reasons that you might think of. We said it, podcast takes time. But when you think about traditional content platforms like TikTok, Instagram Reels, Facebook, even YouTube Shorts, some creators will keep on posting and someday they will have one piece of content that explodes, that gets them thousands, if not dozens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of new followers, and boom, they're set. Especially on short-form content platform because those have a built-in growth algorithm, meaning they reward great content that hooks, captures, retains attention. Unfortunately, podcast platforms do not have that. You can get a few thousand views per TikTok video and all of a sudden one explodes and you get 1 million views on it. But this won't happen with podcasts. But all things considered, this is actually a strength. Because of course you can blow up overnight on TikTok, but your fame can go down at least as fast and you get forgotten into oblivion. This also doesn't happen with podcasts. What you want to do is to actually leverage this to your advantage. Record with video, publish on podcast platforms, and use snippets, great snippets with great content and an even greater hook and put them on short-form media platforms. Truth number 24, your back catalog matters more than you think. New listeners often binge episodes when they discover your show. If your past episodes aren't compelling or relevant, you're losing on a major opportunity. Treat every episode like it could be someone's first. Because if you're doing your job right of growing the podcast, this is what happens. You have new people listening to you at every new episode. And you want to make sure that they come back. And that's it for the 24 brutally honest truths about podcasts. I hope you liked it and that you found this valuable. If that's the case, don't hesitate to leave me a comment on what part of this video helped you the most and you think will have the biggest impact on your podcast so I know what to create content around and give you more of this. Cheers.